This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Summertime allows many of us to enjoy swimming, boating, and fishing. Thanks to the federal Clean Water Act, many rivers, streams, and lakes allow us to do all of these activities safely. But this wasn't always the case. Coming up, we'll learn how a river fire in Cleveland, Ohio helped encourage the passage of federal laws to clean up and control water pollution. Now first, how many of you spend time on the Farmington River? Residents along the 47-mile waterway in northwest Connecticut were alarmed to learn about a chemical spill in June that made it into the river. That spill involved the chemical known as PFAS, short for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and now residents and officials are focusing on the safety of drinking water in Connecticut. Later, we'll hear how other New England states have passed laws limiting the use of these chemicals, once found in products that contain Teflon, like nonstick pans. But to learn more about that Connecticut incident, joining me now in studio is Greg Ladke, environment reporter for the Hartford Courant. Greg, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
So take us back to June 8th when this spill happened that allowed this chemical to get into the Farmington River. What happened?
Well, there was a hangar, a privately operated hangar at Bradley International Airport. It was run by Signature Flight, a big global company servicing aircraft. There was a malfunction in their fire suppression system, and tens of thousands of gallons of water mixed with this PFAS foam, firefighting foam, deluged the hangar, as it's supposed to do in a fire, but there was no fire. The big problem was that it wasn't contained in the hangar, got into the sewer system, ran down to an MDC sewage treatment plant, which is on the Farmington River. That plant, like most sewage plants in Connecticut, is not designed to filter this stuff out. And so it went into the plant and right through out a pipe into the Farmington River. There's estimates that something like 20,000 gallons of this foam water mixture may have gotten into the river.
So this happened on a weekend. How quickly were residents around that area alerted that this spill had happened?
That is a big issue for people in Windsor. Some people said that they didn't learn about it for a week. There were press releases put out by the state warning people initially not to go into the water for swimming or boating. There was that was taken off after a while, but there is still a do not eat fish caught in the river because they still haven't tested enough fish and other marine life to find out if this contaminant is dangerous in terms of the fish.
Mm-hmm. You've been an environment reporter for some time. We're talking about PFAS today because it's something that a lot of us may not have really focused on because of where we live. We're going to find out later on in the show how other states like New Hampshire, residents there have really been actively pushing lawmakers both federally and locally to contain this chemical, especially from waterways. But when we hear about PFAS, what do we know about this chemical and what it can do to us?
It's these compounds, and there are a lot of them. There's more than 4,000 different chemical compounds that are collectively known as PFAS. And the studies have linked them to different types of cancer, kidney disease, thyroid problems, reproductive problems, obesity, damage to the immune system. It may make vaccinations less effective. So there's a whole long range of pretty scary things that they think these chemicals can do to the human body. And the other big problem with this is that they are long-lasting in the environment. They're very difficult to remove once they get into the environment, and their nickname is the forever chemical. Another big problem is that there hasn't been enough research done to find out really what kinds of effects these can have on the environment, on marine life, on animals, and humans.
You mentioned how many tens of thousands of gallons flowed into the Farmington River that officials have been working to clean up. What do we know now about this chemical, this firefighting foam? How much of it is still in the Farmington?
They're doing more testing as they go along. The concentrations were very, very high immediately after the spill, right near where it entered the river. It was much higher than drinking water levels were allowed farther down the river. It's still there, but they're now this week doing more testing, and we should have a better idea in a few days after the results come back. Here's another problem with the whole deal. Apparently, there's only a few labs in the country that do tests for this kind of chemical pollution. So it takes a while. You have to wait your turn.
So if we hear that local officials, specifically in Windsor, testing wells, that could take some time to find out that there's PFAS levels that are higher than what the EPA standard is?
That's a possibility. When the foam mixture ran through the sewage system, it apparently bubbled up on a road through manhole covers in this neighborhood in Windsor called Rainbow Road neighborhood. And there are something like 14 to 20 private wells in that area that they expect to test for this. It's a scary situation, and it has been scary in states, as you said, across the country, where this has become a much bigger issue much earlier than in Connecticut. The state did test a few years ago most of the major drinking water systems in Connecticut, the public water systems, and did not find very high levels of PFAS. And I think that that sort of gave the state officials maybe a false confidence that we didn't have huge problems here. In fact, they said they didn't think it was a widespread issue in Connecticut in an official report. Then there's a well in Greenwich that was found to have very high levels of this stuff, and drinking from that well was banned. Another well in Willimantic was found to have PFAS contamination. And the supposition is that the Greenwich well was polluted from firefighting foam from Westchester Airport, and that the Willimantic well was polluted from firefighting foam that came from a fire training facility that was next door to this property, or very close to it. So there are all kinds of possibilities here, and that's what I think is most worrisome, that it's not just contained to the Farmington River or a particular neighborhood in Windsor. It's a potential statewide issue.
Greg Lackey is environment reporter for the Hartford Courant. You can join our conversation, especially if you live in the town of Windsor. Again, we're talking about PFAS today because of a toxic chemical spill that started at Bradley Airport back June 8th. Now, state officials are looking at how groundwater and whether there is PFAS levels that exceed the EPA level. But if you live in the town of Windsor, you can join us, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. A Windsor resident is joining us now by phone, Charles Button, who lives right by the Farmington River. Charles, welcome to Where We Live.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be part of the conversation.
So, Charles, you live right by the Farmington. This is a river that was recently designated wild and scenic. Lots of people enjoy recreating on the river. Before this spill happened, was PFAS on your radar?
It was on my radar, but not as bright as it is now. Not specifically for the Farmington itself, but just as a general topic to be discussed in the classes I teach at Central Connecticut.
So you live right along the river. When this spill happened, June 8th, how soon before you and your family found out about it?
Well, as you were just discussing with your guest, we really weren't notified by anybody from the top levels down. And what I mean by that is there was never a knock on the door, never a phone call, never anything a notice in the mail or posted on our doors. As all of the neighbors that I've spoke to in Windsor report the same. Nobody reached out to the citizens here to let us know that this had happened. The only way we found out about it was on the internet by chance on Facebook. And then your guest doing great reporting on it. But to this day, is the best of my knowledge, other than the people showing up at the public forums or showing up when Blumenthal spoke the other day and expressing concerns, I still don't know that anyone, perhaps maybe hopefully by now, they're talking to people that have wells. But yeah, I'm not hearing any, personal reach out from any official, from the federal down to the local.
Has this changed, how you live each and every day, Charles, by the river, knowing that this chemical is in the Farmington, and then concerns also about how it's getting into drinking water?
Yeah, well, I had known it was always a potential to get there simply because, we do have the airport, and I'm well aware of it being used there, and I know we also have a few firefighting stations that are located somewhat near the river here in Windsor. And so I knew there was always the potential, but, and I should not be naive like this, considering I'm an environmental scientist and I should know better. But you kind of, I think I heard the word false security presented. We kind of have that same thing. You kind of assume something like an airport is not going to have its drainage go into the wastewater treatment plant systems with chemicals because they're not set up to treat those. So the fact that isn't the case is very disconcerting, especially for us like myself here. I participate in the river a lot, personally for pleasure and recreation. I love to kayak, I love to fish, I like to go swim in the water historically in the past with my kids. I don't feel comfortable doing that. It's very disconcerting for everybody involved.
Greg Gladkey is with me, environment reporter for the Hartford Courant. Is this what you're hearing from other residents along the Farmington River? Greg, people, despite hearing assurances from state officials that it's not, unless you drink the water, you're not going to be endangered. That's not good enough for people when they hear that.
Yeah, I've heard that from a number of people that I've spoken to along the river. I think State Representative Jane Garibay, who represents the area, said when she first heard, it's okay to go in the river, just don't eat the fish. She said, well, I wonder if the guy who told you that would allow his 2-year-old grandson to go in the river. And I think that's the attitude, is this people are worried, they don't really know how safe it may be, and they're still ticked off that they didn't get notified like Charles Button did.
What have you heard from the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, those officials, also public health officials, in terms of what's going to be done now that they know that this spill happened? I know Governor Lamont has put up a task force to look into safety of drinking water around the state. I mean, what are some of the steps moving forward, Greg?
There's going to be more testing of the water in the Farmington. There's going to be these testing of wells in that particular neighborhood where there may have been some leakage from the sewage system. There's going to be testing of major rivers and lakes across Connecticut this summer. The state has reached an agreement with experts at the University of Rhode Island, which is apparently doing an ongoing study of PFAS contamination. And they're going to be testing surface water all across the state. There are also plans to check groundwater contamination around the half dozen or more firefighting training schools in Connecticut. The Department of Defense has allocated more than $60,000, or maybe that's a lowball figure, for testing at the subbase in Groton. The National Guard National Guard at Bradley Airport is also going to be checking spots there for groundwater contamination. So it is a statewide issue that's growing, not getting less, and I think it's now on everybody's radar. Finally, I have to admit that it wasn't high on my radar before the Farmington River spill.
We got a good question from Doreen on Facebook, who wonders, what about firefighters who are exposed, or anyone exposed to this foam in training situations? Should they be concerned?
They are concerned. Firefighters Association this year was solidly behind a piece of legislation that was going to restrict the use of PFAS foam during firefighting training. You have to understand that this substance has been required by the FAA for airports wherever fuel or chemicals are potential spills. It's very effective in stopping those or suppressing those kinds of fires. But the bill that was proposed during the legislative session didn't make it through. And it may have been because there was a $65,000 research price tag attached to it. And we're talking about a state budget of $20 billion plus. So
we'll be talking more with one of the lawmakers who was pushing for that bill to be passed this session. Representative Jonathan Steinberg is going to join us right after the break here on Where We Live. I want to thank Charles Button for calling in, who is a Town of Windsor resident. And you can join us too, 860-275-7266, as we talk about PFAS. Again, this class of chemicals that's found all around us. The focus now because of a chemical spill going into the Farmington River in June. But how safe is our drinking water? Do you feel comfortable with the standards in place here in Connecticut? You can join us, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're learning more about PFAS, a group of man-made chemicals that last in the environment. They've been linked to serious health risks like cancer or kidney and liver issues. Now, PFAS used to be widely found in products like nonstick pans and stain-resistant carpets. Now, PFAS is on the minds of Connecticut residents and officials now after firefighting foam that includes this chemical leaked into the Farmington River in June. In studio with me is Greg Latke, who's been covering the spill and the state's response. He's an environment reporter with the Hartford Courant. Coming up, we're going to talk more about how other New England states have been talking about PFAS and how activists have been pushing lawmakers to do more to make sure that their water is safe. But I wanted to speak quickly now with State Representative Jonathan Steinberg. He represents Westport, also co-chair of the Public Health Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly. Representative Steinberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning.
So PFAS on all of our minds, but this is something that was on your radar, so to speak, in the sense that you even helped try to push a bill through the legislative session regarding research into PFAS. Tell us about that.
Yes. To be clear, it's only relatively new on most of our radar screens, and I think that's true in a lot of states. It was brought to us by Ann Hulick at Clean Water Action. We learned a lot this session. We did our research. We originally started with a much more, a broader bill to look at not only PFAS and the use of firefighting foam, but also in consumer products. And I don't know, Mr. Button mentioned it earlier, but PFAS are a broad range of chemicals with similar molecular structures, but they are different and they have different impacts. We figured out that doing the consumer products piece was more than we could handle, and then we focused exclusively on the firefighting foam for training purposes. And as he mentioned, it is the most effective way to deal with certain types of fires. And there hasn't been an approved effective alternative, even though there are some alternatives out there. This bill passed unanimously out of our committee, but it was one of three bills that had to go to the Appropriations Committee because it had a fiscal note. For those who are not familiar, if it's going to cost the state money to implement, that's something that the Appropriations Committee has to approve and see is actually in the budget. Two of our three bills were approved through appropriations. This one was not, for a seemingly modest amount of $75,000. But it's reflective of the state of the state. We've had years and years of budget cuts, and we've constrained our agencies, the Department of Public Health, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, to the point where we're making it very hard to protect the public health to protect the environment because we don't have the resources available.
And yet, with the announcement by Governor Lamont that there's now an interagency task force looking specifically at PFAS, again, after this spill happened in the Farmington River, Governor Lamont even saying that with this task force, we want to get ahead of the curve. It sounds like that's too little too late, Representative Steinberg.
Well, I can't say with certainty that even if we had passed the legislation, it would have necessarily prevented the accident that occurred, but it would have been a step in the right direction. Again, this is something which we would have hoped would have been dealt with much more aggressively at the federal level, but there's been no indication in recent years there's any interest in evaluating, let alone constraining a lot of the chemicals we put into our food chain and into the environment. There are literally tens of thousands of chemicals that have not been tested to the degree that we know that PFAS are dangerous. And that's really the tragedy of this all. We knew it was a problem, and yet we have not had the resolve, or in the case of Connecticut, the resources to necessarily protect the public.
I mentioned, Representative Steinberg, you're co-chair of the Public Health Committee. So tell us, moving forward, what you want to see happen in terms of addressing PFAS, as well as maybe the legislator taking another look at this come the next session?
I'm confident we'll raise another bill. It may be substantially similar to what we passed last year, and we're going to have to do a better job of convincing appropriations that it's worthy of a fairly modest funding investment. I think that will happen. Obviously, when you have an incident like this that really shines a spotlight on the problem, everybody gets on board, and the governor and the commissioners of DEEP and DPH are also taking the lead. I'm pretty confident we can do that. But I won't pretend necessarily that resolves the problem, that it's a complete solution. And I think, to your point, we're going to have to continue to explore further about some of the other PFAS variants, what kind of products they're in, what, if anything, one state, a small state like Connecticut, can do about it. And as you mentioned, other states are looking at this as well, but potentially if enough states, particularly contiguous states, all pass similar legislation, we have the critical mass that might force some of these chemical users to actually change their ways.
Before I let you go, Representative Steinberg, I know that you represent Westport and you are representative in the Connecticut General Assembly, but when you hear about after this spill happening in Windsor that residents didn't feel like they were properly notified, should there also be some attention drawn to when this kind of spill happens, that there should be a better way to let the community know that this has happened? Again, Greg Latke had mentioned, some signs were put up by the river, but not ones that are very noticeable. We heard from residents who said that they really didn't know about it until days later.
Yeah, I have to admit I was surprised by that. Maybe I've been resting under the assumption that those protocols for communication exist. I would have thought both DEEP and DPH had existing process in place for a calamity of this magnitude. Obviously, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board and ensure that we have effective, comprehensive communication for an event like this. I think that's going to happen. I think that's easily one of the deliverables from the task force the governor's putting together, that we can be highly confident that should something happen, that the public is aware, and also the choices they need to make are made eminently clear so there can be no confusion and nobody can be harmed.
Thank you, State Representative Jonathan Steinberg, who represents Westport, for joining us here in Where We Live. Greg Latke from the Hartford Courant.
Yeah, one of the things that the representative was talking about, these budget cuts that have gone on year after year, have really slashed the staffs of state agencies like environmental protection and public health to a degree. It may be that their staff shortages played a role in the fact that they weren't communicating that well.
You can join us here on Where We Live, 860-275-7266, as we talk and learn more about PFAS, again, a class of man-made chemicals that have been linked to serious health risks found in water supplies, found all around us in the environment. You can join us again on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We wanted to know more about how residents in other states have pushed policymakers to better control how much PFAS is allowed in their water. They include New Hampshire residents, where my next guest has reported extensively on PFAS. Annie Ropeek is joining us from New Hampshire Public Radio. She's an environmental reporter. Annie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we're hearing that in Connecticut, a lot of eyes are opening now to the dangers of PFAS. But in New Hampshire, this is something that community members have been talking about for some time. Why is that?
Yeah, that's right. So like Representative Steinberg said, this is an issue that is pretty new to everyone, but it has first emerged in New Hampshire really as far back as 2014 and 2016. Those are when two big contamination hotspots kind of emerged. So we have a factory in the Manchester area that makes performance plastics that's using PFAS chemicals in its manufacturing process. The company is called Saint-Gobain, and they're actually also responsible for some contamination in Vermont. And then they came down to New Hampshire and emitted these chemicals into the air and contaminated hundreds of private drinking water wells and some public water supplies in that area. So the state has been dealing with that for years now. And between that and then we also have a military base near Portsmouth called Pease Tradeport, or a former military base rather, where the contamination from PFAS there is really due to these firefighting foams that were used like they were in Connecticut. And so those two hotspots have been ongoing for a few years now, and the state has really sort of learned as it goes about what these chemicals are, how to clean them up, and all the while the technology has been evolving too, and the public consciousness of it. And so those things have really precipitated some pretty aggressive action on the part of the state. New Hampshire is really one of a small number of states across the country that are really on the cutting edge of trying to regulate PFAS and just trying to clean it up and understand it and make it a priority. And so I would say New Hampshire is probably the New England state that has done the most on this, although we're also starting to see Maine and Mass and Vermont really take up the charge as well.
Annie, when we talk about the safe levels or standards, so to speak, what does the EPA say is safe? And, when we look at states like New Hampshire, what are community members wanting, or how have laws been changed to maybe set those standards even lower than what the EPA says is safe?
Yeah, so this has really been the central question of the debate here for a long time. The EPA, so there's no binding federal regulations around these chemicals, although the EPA does sort of have those in the works now. It's going to be years before those are actually in effect, and there is debate around what the numbers should be. So right now the EPA has what's called a health advisory. It's non-binding. It just is sort of advice to states, and several states, including New Hampshire, made that into law as soon as it came out in 2016. And that number says for two PFAS chemicals, sort of the most common and most studied ones, including the ingredients in Teflon and firefighting foam, which are PFOA and PFOS, the number should be, the exposure, lifetime exposure should be no greater than 70 parts per trillion. So we often hear people in the PFAS world say, parts per trillion, it's so small, but I think that it can be kind of misleading. I mean, just because these are really small numbers doesn't mean that science doesn't show these chemicals can be dangerous at those really low amounts. Tiny little particles out of trillions can potentially cause health effects. So the EPA says 70. But then we had last year a study from the Centers for Disease Control that said something different. So the Centers for Disease Control says you might start to see health risks at levels more around the 7 or 10 or 15 parts per trillion level, depending on what chemical we're talking about. So it's a fraction of the EPA's recommendation. And the CDC is very careful to say, these are just the screening levels where, like, if we see numbers around these levels, that is the minimum level at which we would go in and start to look for more problems. It's not necessarily the level at which you're guaranteed to get sick, far from it. But advocates really picked those up and said, why is the EPA going with this more lenient standard when federal researchers in another agency are saying it should be far lower or could potentially be more protective for it to be far lower? And so states like New Hampshire have been grappling with that range, and New Hampshire is one of a few states that is trying to write its own drinking water regulations on PFAS. And originally, when the proposals came out this past January, the numbers were a little bit closer to the EPA end of the spectrum. They were, more or less in line with that more lenient standard. There was a ton of public pushback from advocates in places like Portsmouth and Merrimack, New Hampshire, where they're living with contamination. And now the new proposals that just came out a few weeks ago and are up for legislative approval in a couple of weeks are far, far lower. They're right around the CDC level. We're proposing 12 parts per trillion for PFOA. That's down from the initial proposal of 38, and 15 for PFOS, which is down from 70. And we've got 2 other chemicals in our list as well. And there are other states that are down around those levels too. In fact, like most states that are trying to write their own rules are opting for lower numbers once they actually take the step to study the science themselves and try to do something from scratch.
Greg Ladke's environment reporter for the Hartford Courant. Connecticut follows the EPA standard?
It does to a certain degree. It uses that 70 parts per trillion number, but it applies it to not only the 2 chemical compounds that the EPA says should be part of it, but 3 other PFAS chemicals. So it's the state says our standard is tougher than the EPA's, but it's nowhere near as stringent as the CDC recommendation.
You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Anne's calling. She's actually the Connecticut director of Clean Water Act. Anne, go ahead.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much for taking my call. And first, I just wanted to thank you so much for covering this issue. It's been one that, as other folks have noted, has not received a lot of media attention in Connecticut, despite the fact that it really is a national crisis. And so I just wanted to thank you and Greg Latke, who's been doing an excellent job covering this since the spill. Our group at Clean Water Action has been involved in a national coalition working on PFAS for the last couple of years now. So we've been fortunate to be working with experts all over the country who are dealing with this problem and have learned a lot from what other states are doing. And as your previous guest mentioned, New Hampshire and Vermont, New York and New Jersey are really moving forward with some much stricter health policies. So I just wanted to comment that our group is Clean Water Action will continue to be strongly working on this issue and advocating for health protective policies. We're pleased to see Governor Lamont taking action. I'm pleased to continue to work with Representative Steinberg, who was a leader on this issue. But we really need to see not just study, we need to make sure that we are enacting comprehensive policies that include, obviously, restriction of this firefighting foam. There is fluorine-free foam available that is equally as effective. We need to set strict drinking water standards, as your other guests and Greg mentioned. That will not happen at the federal level anytime soon, so states need to step up. And we need to make sure that we are reducing other sources of exposure, particularly food packaging, which is a major source of contamination of our food and is a major source of how we get PFAS chemicals in our bodies.
Well, Anne, thank you for giving us a call. I just wanted to go back to our guest, Annie Ropeek, who's been covering PFAS in New Hampshire. She's an environment reporter for New Hampshire Public Radio. We heard Anne, who's the Connecticut director of Clean Water Act, talk about alternatives. So let's and I also heard this from Representative Steinberg, because we're focusing in on this firefighting foam that spilled into the Farmington River. What do we know about the alternatives and how safe are they?
Yeah, so it's a great question. There are alternatives. There's, in particular, this class called Gen X chemicals, which are sort of the successors to PFAS in the industrial context. If PFAS chemicals are considered long-chain molecules, so that's part of why they're potentially toxic, because they're just really complicated molecules, and that's why they're hard to treat for. So Gen X are shorter-chain versions of those same compounds, and are thought to be less persistent in the environment, and again are completely unregulated at this point. And there are some concerns that those may have similar health effects. So, if PFAS is still an emerging contaminant, then Gen X is even farther behind on that process. But we've already seen some litigation in states like North Carolina around Gen X contamination near manufacturing facilities there. So I guess the short answer is there aren't clear alternatives to specifically what PFAS chemicals do because they're synthetic. I mean, it's not a natural process. And so I've heard a lot of advocates say, well, the alternative is you use cast iron pans and you stop wearing Gore-Tex, you stop using stain-resistant carpeting. And it's important to note that the original class of PFAS chemicals that we're talking about that are in your firefighting foam are no longer used in American manufacturing. The EPA got the big manufacturers to agree to phase those out in the mid-2000s. But there are still plenty of products in circulation that are older that contain the chemicals. It can still be used overseas and imported potentially. And particularly on the firefighting foam issue, these are chemicals that are stored up in tanks like you had at your airport and or that are in the sprinkler systems or just, that kind of are stockpiled. And some litigation has shown that the firefighting foam manufacturers allegedly kind of went out of their way not to tell people to stop using those stockpiles when the chemicals were being phased out. And so that's why you're still seeing these sort of legacy, quote unquote, PFAS contaminants causing contamination in those firefighting foams, even though they're no longer necessarily manufacturing them because they're older foams that are still around and no one's thought to get rid of them. So that's some of what this legislation we're hearing about is seeking to do. And there's similar action at the federal level that's actually kind of caught up in the big defense spending bill that President Trump is threatening to veto, in part because of these provisions that would tell military installations to try to use less PFAS and to kind of take action around that. But it's a big problem. And so alternatives-wise, there's no clear answer, and it's just one of a million unanswered questions that we're all trying to focus on at the same time as we talk about science and health effects and levels, and cost in particular is a big unanswered question as well.
Greg Ladke.
Yeah, one of the things that the state is now trying to do is in Connecticut is to figure out how much of this firefighting foam is actually stored around the state. We have something over 300 different fire departments. They do know that this firefighting PFAS foam is stored in 6 different trailers that the state positioned around the state after 9/11 to fight major fires or major catastrophes. And so no one really knows how much of this stuff is in Connecticut right now.
Well, we hope to revisit this topic again here on Where We Live. I want to thank Greg Ladke, who's an environment reporter with the Hartford Courant. We know that you're on the PFAS beat. We thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
Also, Annie Ropeek, who's been reporting on PFAS for New Hampshire Public Radio. Annie, thank you.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Up next, activists continue to raise concerns over the Trump administration's rollbacks of some regulations that target the Federal Clean Water Act. After the break, we're going to learn about what was going on in Cleveland, Ohio, and other cities in the 50s and 60s that led to the passage of the law protecting our nation's waterways. You can join us, too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The Federal Clean Water Act in 1972 helped clean up and regulate pollution. Now, many point to a river fire in Cleveland, Ohio as the catalyst to the passage of the Clean Water Act. My next guest is a historian who wrote the book Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland. He's going to fill in some of the details of that era. David Stradling, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Lucy. It's good to be here.
So I understand there's a myth that surrounds this fire that happened in '69 on the Cuyahoga River. You were going to focus your book on that, but let's talk more about what you learned about this story and how a lot of people had the facts wrong.
Mm-hmm. So our research really began with my brother, Richard Stradling, who helped me write the book. He's a journalist and was studying the journalistic response to the Cuyahoga fire of 1969, and then discovered that there were many, many more fires that had happened in Cleveland over the years, at least a dozen others that made the newspapers, and we suspect that many other fires didn't make the newspapers, starting in the late 19th century. So what we really discovered is that this was a city that mostly thought of its burning river as problematic for economic reasons. It was very dangerous, obviously, to have a flammable waterway that ran through the middle of your industrial zone. There was oil refining, chemical manufacturers, and of course the big steel mills in Cleveland. And so really all of the coverage, including the immediate coverage after the 1969 fire, really focused on the economic problems of having such a polluted waterway. But what really got us going with the book was discovering the role of Carl Stokes in the last of the fires in the 1969 fire. He was the first African-American mayor of any large American city, and it was his activism around solving the urban crisis while simultaneously solving the environmental crisis that really caught our attention.
This was seen as an iconic fire. Again, many point to this as being the catalyst to the Clean Water Act. But even the picture that was used to show what this fire looked like wasn't even accurate.
That's right. There hadn't been very much national coverage of the 69 fire for almost 2 months after the fire took place. The New York Times didn't run a story on it. The Washington Post didn't run a story on it. Even other regional papers in Ohio didn't run a story on the fire. But in August of 1969, Time magazine ran a one-page piece about polluted waterways in American cities, and it ran a photograph of the fire on the Cuyahoga while describing the fire that happened that June. But the photograph was actually from 1952, a much worse, much larger fire that was terribly damaging to a tugboat company. And it's a very dramatic photograph of one of the boats kind of caught in an oil slick that's on fire and firefighters training water on it from the Jefferson Avenue Bridge. So readers, I think, logically concluded that this was a photograph of a river that had finally gotten so polluted that it burst into flames, and that was really the impression I think that Time magazine really wanted readers to take, is that we had reached this crisis point, and you can see it in that image. There was no mention of the fact that the Cuyahoga had caught on fire many times before.
And lots of other rivers that were dealing with the same issue of lakes being polluted because of industry. You mentioned you ended up focusing on Carl Stokes, who was the mayor of Cleveland at the time. His hands pretty much tied in dealing with this pollution? There was no federal help before then.
Right. There are many ways in which Carl Stokes felt powerless to solve the problem of the pollution on the Cuyahoga, but lots of other problems too, including air pollution, which was many people probably would have said was the worst environmental problem in Cleveland at the time, mostly from the steel mills, but from lots of other sources as well. Yeah, he took reporters on what my brother and I called the pollution tour the day after the fire to try and kind of encourage more coverage of the fire itself and also about the environmental crisis too and the way it affected Cleveland. He pointed out that the city of Cleveland couldn't convince suburban districts, for example, suburban communities, to tie into sewage treatment plants. So a lot of the sewage from the suburbs just upstream from Cleveland just flowed into the river, and that could affect, obviously, water quality and also oil slicks. That he, in fact, did not have the authority to regulate what it was that industry inside or outside of Cleveland put into the river. That was up to the state of Ohio, which issued permits. They had a pro-growth attitude, and mostly they just went along with industry's sense that they could only invest so much money in water pollution control technology. So he was hamstrung in a couple of different ways, and he became an advocate for federalizing regulation of water pollution and issuing permits or gradually restricting permits on what can be dumped into waterways.
I had talked about this being seen as a catalyst for the Clean Water Act, but that's not even accurate considering that the movement, the environmental movement, was really picking up steam, so to speak, and growing. But this was symbolic, even though even the picture was inaccurate to the specific fire. That's really what got the federal lawmakers to pass the Clean Water Act, including a relation to Stokes?
Yeah, I think he played a part in it, but I will say I think that mayors around the country who are concerned about their own waterways played a part in it too. The Hudson River was terribly polluted. The Potomac River was terribly polluted at the time. So there were so many different waterways that were troubled. I think had the Cuyahoga River not caught fire in '69, we would have gotten the Clean Water Act anyway. I don't think it's really causal here. But what it does is it allows people to tell this kind of straightforward story about how a river caught fire. People suddenly awakened to the terrible pollution in the United States, and then legislators got busy and passed what became a very effective law. I think there are aspects to that story that are true, but mostly what it does is it erases a lot of work that had gone into getting people ready for the idea that the federal government should be the ultimate sovereignty as far as controlling regulation of the environment, both air and water pollution. And that's a very long story, as your introduction noted. It goes back to the very late 40s and 1950s, where sometimes legislators, sometimes scientists, sometimes citizen activists were demanding for better regulation and not getting the results that they needed at the local or state level, and then gradually making demands on the federal government.
David, I mentioned to our listeners you're a historian. When we think about the story that was happening in Cleveland back in '69, and what is the relevance of looking at this chapter again when today the cause for change focused on climate change, but still a lot of doubters of the science that exists that tells us that we're in big trouble?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why this story gains so much attention. In fact, it gains more and more attention, of course. Through the years, it's amazing. If you look through newspapers, there are probably as many references to the Cuyahoga River fire in the 1990s as there were in the 1980s and the 1970s. And of course, now we're at the 50th anniversary of the Cuyahoga fire, so there are lots and lots of references to it. And I think that it becomes just kind of an object lesson. The Cuyahoga River is much cleaner now. It is once again a recreational waterway. In the city of Cleveland, it still performs some industrial duty. They still bring ore boats up the Cuyahoga River to the steel mills, which are operating once again after a period of hiatus. So it is. I think the Cuyahoga has become a much more complete, usable river, and it's emblematic of Cleveland's revival. So I think it's a real success story for the Clean Water Act, and it has been held up as such in the city of Cleveland to let people know that in fact the regulation that came from this fire in this mythology has actually been effective.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Meanwhile, focus on environmental changes. But Carl Stokes, as mayor of Cleveland, was also dealing with a lot of other issues in his city. Today, we know that you can't just deal with one issue. Many of them are intertwined, such as social issues. When we look at Flint, Michigan, and the power to fix infrastructure, and the fact that certain communities are plagued with dealing with pollution versus others.
Yes, Stokes was well ahead of his time in recognizing the ways in which the urban and environmental crises overlapped and reinforced each other, that some of the problems of Cleveland, the fact that so many middle-class residents had fled in the 50s and 60s and were continuing to do so, in fact, in increasing numbers in the 1970s. Part of that had to do with the fact that it was a terribly polluted environment, and suburbs offered much more attractive places to live and send your kids to school. He recognized that Cleveland was not going to be able to solve its problems related to poverty and joblessness if it couldn't also improve the environment, make it a more livable community. His major concern, I think, as mayor, was really housing. He knew that particularly the African American population, which was rather concentrated in the neighborhoods that were closest to downtown, were living in substandard housing. He himself had grown up in public housing and was a strong supporter of government intervention to make certain that everybody had at least the bare minimums as far as housing is concerned.
David Stradling, again, is professor of history at University of Cincinnati, also co-author of Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland. David, thank you for joining us today here on Where We Live.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks to Lydia Brown on the phones. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. You can learn more about the show at WNPR.org/where we live. You can also download our podcast anytime. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.